Hello, I'm Jenifer Gaston. I own Woolen Willow Designs, and I'm the creative director for Primitive Quilts and Projects Magazine. I want to first thank the Grace Company for inviting me to be a part of their Spring Fling Festival and to tell you a little bit about myself and my history of quilting and share with you some of my quilts. For me, I started sewing when I was a little girl, like a lot of us did. My mother got me started with crochet and just some simple stitching. She was an avid seamstress. She made countless clothes for herself, for work, and for all four of her girls. And she let us all use her scrap bag, which was full of so many different fabrics. She made wedding dresses, slip covers, bridesmaid dresses. Two of my sisters used to play guitar, sing, and perform, and so she made them many dresses. So she had the best scrap bag, and so our dolls, trolls, Barbies, Skippers, all were the very best dressed. And then from that, we all went on to making clothes for ourselves. When we grew up, I know I did, I'm pretty sure my other sisters did too, made pillows and curtains, dust ruffles, things like that for our houses. And then I would say about 29 years ago, my mother got a beautiful quilt top that her grandmother had made, and her two sisters also got quilt tops, and the three of them decided they were going to learn how to quilt. And that just started the ball rolling. One of my cousins and I both got the bug, and we started quilting. I bought the fabric to make my first pieced quilt about a year before I actually got brave enough to cut into it. And I would say that was probably about 29 years ago, and my mother started a little bit before that. But she came over one day with all of her tools because I didn't have the tools yet, and helped me to get the fabric all cut out and made my first quilt. This quilt is a thimbleberries pattern, and the instructions did not include any new methods of making half square triangles. I'm not sure if there wasn't such a thing back then, or if it just didn't call for it. So I cut a lot of little triangles, sewing them all back together again. And being that it was my first piece quilt, I did a lot of ripping out. So I did cut off quite a few points, but I still love the quilt and I display it, and it just shows me how far I've come. And then, a few years went by, and after making several quilts, mostly small things, baby quilts for myself and for my friends, I decided to start doing rug hooking and working with wool. And I got really busy with that and didn't do as much quilting. And I started designing rugs. And my sister Gretchen also did that with me. And I would say that was probably in about 1998. And then in 1999, we opened up an online store called the Rug Hooking Store. And we took orders from all over, wholesale orders, retail orders. And that was the first business that we had. And then in 2004, we decided to open up a shop together, a brick and mortar, and we opened up the Woolen Willow. And we did rug hooking, wool applique, and quilting. We brought in all the quilt fabric. And shortly after that, we started designing quilts and things like that. And several years later, we got a long arm machine in our quilt shop. We had learned how to do machine quilting just by moving our quilts around underneath our machine. And we decided that it would be good for our shop to have a long arm and start taking in customer quilts. So we got some practice doing that. Mostly just meandering and stippling. I did get to where I could do some swirls and simple flowers and stars. But I was always most comfortable doing stippling. And owning a shop, you don't always have all the time to do the practicing it takes to get really good at it. And so then several years later, we started the magazine Primitive Quilts and Projects. And that sort of happened on accident. We had a customer come into the shop and she was looking at all of the magazines that we had to offer. And she said, somebody needs to come up with a primitive style magazine because all of these other magazines rarely have anything in there that are the style that I like. And that was the style of our quilt shop, which was primitive. And so a light bulb went on and my sister walked by and I said, "Hey, I got an idea. Let's start a magazine." And we high-fived and we headed to the local Mexican restaurant that day after we closed up the shop. And over margaritas, we talked about it and called our sister Judy and said, "Hey, Jude, would you like to go in with us to start a magazine?" And she said, "Sure." And she, at the time, worked a full-time job for the government. And on her way home, stopped at the local bookstore and bought a book called How to Publish a Magazine. And she read the book. We started having meetings. We got some advice from our friends who had started and ran the Bird Watchers Digest. And they got us hooked up with some people to talk to. And pretty soon we were doing a magazine. And so we got really busy with that and decided to close our quilt shop. I think it was around 2016. And then we started working from home. And we sold the long arm that we had at the shop. And I was really kind of missing that because I had gotten used to quilting my quilts that way instead of moving them around under my home machine. So I had to go back to that. And I'm okay. I'm pretty good with that. But again, I really just do stippling. So, I didn't really, that wasn't my life's goal, was to be a really great, famous long arm designer. I just really wanted to quilt my quilts. So after we closed the shop and we're doing some quilt markets with the magazine, we got to know the people at the Grace Company, and they came to our booth and they asked us, "Why would we want to advertise in your magazine, being that it's a primitive style?" And we showed them why. We showed them all of the pretty quilts in our magazine. Many of them were quilted by using a long arm. And we kind of hit up a nice friendship, and they started to advertise with the magazine. And then after that, I got to talking with Nathan one day at one of the markets, and I told him a little bit about my other business, which was Woolen Willow Designs, which after we stopped the shop, I started a new website and just have my online shop for my patterns. And we got to talking, and he thought, "We knew we might be a good fit for you to be one of our ambassadors." And so we kind of started that ball rolling, and I got a hoop frame, and I used it with my Janome domestic machine at first. And that worked fine, except I was used to having a long arm. And so not having all of the space that I was used to do my quilting, I felt like it just wasn't working out for me. So I bought the Qnique 19. And since then, it's been great. I've quilted several quilts on it, and I love that it just fits in my space without taking up a whole lot of room. And we'll pan around in a minute and show you my setup. It's a pretty good size sewing room, but I really didn't want to give up a lot of space for a regular long arm frame. So this works out great for me. I do a lot of small quilts and some big quilts. So it really works out good for me. This quilt is called Happy Garden. I did this as a sew along in my Facebook group, which is called Primitive Stitchin' with Jenifer Gaston. I do about 2 sew-alongs a year with that group. Again, I did a lot of stippling. It's my favorite to do. I just really love the way it makes that applique stand out. I do a little bit of quilting on the applique as well sometimes. This quilt is called A Life of Plenty. I did this as a sew-along. It was the first sew-along I ever did on my blog, Jenny from the Willow at blogspot.com. It's made with about 100 different fabrics, including wool and cotton and velvet. This was quilted by my cousin Jill on a long arm. She has a business in Erie, Pennsylvania called Quilting. It just is a good evidence that you can have a really primitive quilt and also have beautiful custom long arm quilting. This quilt is called Log Cabin Garden. I did a lot of stippling on this one. I left out the scallops so they would kind of spring forward. I did a good amount of quilting on the wool to hold those down. And I really love how this one comes out. It's got such a cozy look since it has the homespun fabrics. It's one of my favorites. Okay. Quilt, I decided to try something other than stippling. I practiced on my whiteboard doing feathers and pebbles, and I really like how it turned out. I'm just going to have to get brave and do that on a big quilt. All right, this is called Sweet and Simple Stitchery, another sew-along quilt. All of these are on my website, Woolen Willow Designs. This was patchwork, embroidery on a linen background, and wool applique. I just did a tiny stipple all over. Okay, this one is called The Great Primitive Pumpkin. I played around with this one on the long arm with stars, swirls. I did some kind of wavy lines on the crow and on the pumpkin. I hear the dog coming in the room. That's Chester. This is a really fun quilt. Great big appliques. It's a snuggly one too. Okay, this is called Ready for Spring. I just finished this one on my group Sew Along. Used a linen type background for all the blocks, wool applique, pretty patchwork, and lots of stippling. All right. This is just a little one. You don't really have to zoom on it. It's called Pumpkin Time. I did this for a fall issue for Primitive Quilts and Projects a few years back. Just a linen-y fabric. I like to mix my fabrics. Linen, cotton, wool, lots of stippling. All right, this one was for 2020 fall issue of Primitive Quilts and Projects. I did paper piecing, wonky flying geese, and really small stippling and extra quilting on the pumpkins and the leaf detail. This was a lot of fun to make. I did a YouTube video for Primitive Quilts and Projects on how to make the wonky flying geese blocks. That was fun. Okay, this is the last one on the table. This is called Fresh and Fancy. It's much brighter colors than I normally use, but still primitive, because primitive is not a color, it's just a style. And I just love how the appliques really stand out with all that tiny stippling all the way around it. This quilt has a little special meaning for me. I wrapped my mother up in this while she was in her hospital bed before she passed away last year. It's nice and snuggly. Okay. And then I have this quilt on the wall. This is called Jenny's String Garden. I decided to try some doodly looking vines in the dark rose. I quilted a vine all the way up and did squirrel flowers and leaves. And then in the light rose, I did echo quilting around the appliques. I wasn't really happy with my echoing skill, but now that it's done, bound, and washed, I like it pretty well. And this was also a sew-along in my group. So this is my Q19 and my hoop frame. I really love it. It just takes up about 5 feet of space. I'm able to move it a little bit. If I need a little bit more space out in my room, I can scooch it back when I'm not using it. I really enjoy having this. It's very easy to use. I bought the leaders. It's great. If I've started on a project and I'm not in a hurry to get it done and I need to get something else done, I can just whip it off of there and pop a new one on and get it finished. I sort of have a primitive lighting system right now. I've got some clip lamps that I'll put on here. I think the next thing I'm going to get is the light bar to go over top. And I think that'll be a lot nicer than moving my lamps all the time. So this is my hoop frame, my Q19. I love them. And I can't wait to get started practicing on this little panel here. So I think that's about all I have out to show you. I really just wanted to share my journey about how I got started, how you don't really have to be a fantastic quilter. It's really fulfilling to be able to finish them yourself. And I really, really enjoy having that hoop frame. And so we're going to do just a little pan around my sewing room so you can see how nicely it fits in. I happen to put a little panel in there to practice on, and then it'll end up as a play quilt for my granddaughter. So we are going to pan around. You'll see my sewing room and maybe the dog. He's somewhere in here snoring. So thank you very much. This is just a quick little pan around my sewing room. I have a nice little wool stash, fat quarters, scraps, my little sewing area. Got some cool old cabinets to put my threads in. And most of my yardage, fabric, and my shelves. Got a Cricut. I've only used it a couple of times, but my daughter really enjoys it. And then there's my hoop frame and my Q19. And I love it.